Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Today I want to talk about whether AI should run our government and whether or not it's a good idea, whether society will approve of it, and whether it's inevitable, whether society approves of it or not. So let's take a look at a whole bunch of things. The first thing I'm going to start with is I have a feeling that nobody, very few people at least, are satisfied with their government. There was a recent poll that showed that 70% of US citizens, regardless of their political party, were dissatisfied with the government, with Congress in particular, and I would say that's fairly consistent with anecdotal evidence from talking to other people such as I have, and also, of course, listening to people who, even if they're very much in favor of the party in power, always find fault with what's going on. So people generally do not like their government. People generally don't think the government is looking out for their own best interests and things like that. So should we take a radical approach and redo government as artificial intelligence? If we do that, what even does that look like? So as I said, the problem is that we all pretty much hate our government. And in this video, I'm going to focus on the US, but I think this applies to most other countries. It's just because I'm the most familiar with the US governmental system, but obviously you can project this into other governments around the world. I'm going to focus today on democratic governments because I think fascist governments are, it's kind of terrifying how they might use artificial intelligence, and they very well might do that. But what I want to focus on instead is a democratic government being replaced by artificial intelligence, either in part or overall. So what if AI does take over? We could think about this in many different forms, from a tool of the government, which could be utilized by human beings, obviously, to local government, so the local town council or a mayor of a small city or something like that, all the way up to state government and, of course, federal government, including, of course, Congress and the presidency itself. And I will even throw in there potentially the judicial branch as well. This is something I hadn't thought about until relatively recently, but the judicial branch might be an excellent place for artificial intelligence to not only serve, but potentially control. So of course, if we did allow AI to take over some or all of government, what would this look like? And the big sort of question is, can technology fix what humans have broken? Humans have pretty much broken government. Government does not work very well at all. And I know that many people, proponents of large morass governments, the kind of battleship version of government, will say that the whole point of government is it's very slow, very difficult to change. But the world is changing rapidly, and there needs to be a relatively more rapid response to things that are going on. So the counter argument is that traditional government is just not adequate to the task anymore. And if you haven't seen my video on the crisis in higher education, you should definitely check that out, because that actually relates to this video pretty solidly, because higher education is a gigantic bureaucracy in its own right. Nothing compared to government, but it's a pretty giant bureaucracy. And so the two share a lot of problems and a lot of potential solutions. So anyway, can technology fix what humans have broken, or will it just make it worse? And as an interesting sidelight to all of this is the America Party, Elon Musk's new party that I don't know if it's actually been created at this point, but the one that he is threatening to create. Is that a glance at the future? Is that going to be technology first, AI first? Are they going to utilize things like that, or is it going to be more of a traditional type of party, just like the Democrats and Republicans in the US and the Whigs and Tories in the UK, etc.? So I'm going to focus on three areas where AI could be used in government, and they progressively get bigger and bigger. So the first one is as a worker bee that is actually, part of the government that's running things, but is not an elected official. It's more of a tool. So that's the first potential sphere that we could be talking about. The second one, of course, is AI as elected officials. And then the third one is AI as like a swarm mind, as something that's not restricted to the traditional ideas of government and individuals being elected to office. So the first one I want to look at is AI as the worker bee. So this would be a tool, not a governor itself. So this would not be an elected official, but something that worked inside the government. And of course, that's immediately going to make a lot of people think about the deep state and the fact that there are all these people who are unelected who are working in the government. I personally think that those people are just doing the best they can. They're trying to keep things running as well as they can. But there are, of course, a lot of people who disagree with that. So maybe they would start calling this the deep AI state or something along those lines. One thing to note here is this is being done already. We have worker bees, we have humans using artificial intelligence tools in pretty much every sector of society at this point, and certainly in government. They are writing bills, they're reading bills, they're critiquing bills, they're replying to these bills, and of course they're being used in emails and marketing strategies for individuals in the government and all of that other stuff. So we don't know how deeply this runs already, but it certainly runs pretty deeply already. So AI is, I would say, already being used as a worker worker bee in government, so we're kind of already there. Now, the next stage, of course, is to pull this out of the dark and into the open and make it part of official policy in a given state, that these AI worker bees would be sanctioned to do the work rather than people just sort of using them, and that therefore AI-generated content would have a certain status in government rather than being sort of hidden as it is right now. So of course, a more tech-forward state like California or a more laissez-faire sort of state like Texas, those are my two sort of antipodes, I think. You've got California that's highly regulated but is also highly tech-forward, and then you've got Texas that's laissez-faire, that's like, we don't care what you do, just go ahead and do it. I think those two kind of governmental institutions could be the ones that could allow this type of government to be officially sanctioned, and that then other states that are more in the middle would follow suit one after another. So if entry-level and mid-level governmental roles were taken over by AI, you certainly would get a large efficiency boost. You would reduce bureaucratic delays. You could also have 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week service. Of course, we already have some of that stuff, but it doesn't work very well, so maybe it would be better than it is right now. We could have data-driven decisions to cut waste. We could have upgrades in computer systems and languages that could also cut waste and save billions of dollars for US taxpayers. But of course, the counter to that is massive job losses and also the potential for no oversight. If you have very few humans in charge of all this stuff, if things start going off the rails, who is going to be watching all of this going on? Who's going to be able to take steps to make sure that things get back on track again? That's an interesting question if the lunatics are running the asylum, isn't it? All right, turning from that, let's talk about AI as an elected official. So we're no longer talking about worker bees, working for elected officials. We're actually talking about elected officials being artificial intelligence. What does that mean? It's a little bit unclear at this point, but you could have AI running everything from, again, local city councils in very small townships or even villages, again, all the way up to state government and federal government and even potentially the presidency of the United States or the equivalent in other countries. And the big difference between this and the worker bees, of course, is that humans like we would be electing this AI to government. We would be saying, yes, I want that or you or whatever that thing is to be running the government and looking out for my best interests. And I'm going to reserve societal acceptance towards the end of this video, but this is planting the seeds for that, right? Are people going to be willing to elect an artificial intelligence? If they do, is it going to have to be embodied? In other words, will it need to look like this guy here? It's kind of a weird little robot thing. I had Gemini generate these images for me, so it's rather interesting that I'm using AI for this particular presentation. But anyway, are we going to need an actual embodied robot, something with a body to vote for? Or could it just be a computer screen that we're voting for instead? If it is an embodied robot, what does that even mean? Because you can upgrade a robot like every day, right? Your computer gets new software all the time. Your Tesla gets new software all the time. Hell, your phone gets new software all the time. So what happens if you elect Bob the Robot and then 2 months from now, Bob the Robot goes from Bob the Robot 1.7 to 1.85 or 2.0? Is that the same elected official that it used to be? Will people care? That's a very, very strange thing because, of course, we expect human beings more or less to be consistent across time. Obviously, you grow and you change as you age, but we expect Bob the Senator at 40 years old to behave pretty much the same way that Bob the Senator at 50 will behave. And these robots don't necessarily have to do that. They could, of course, the upgrades could cause them to continue to run the same way, but they might not be anymore. And regardless of whether they look the same and whether they behave the same, are they the same robot anymore? Is this the ship of Theseus? If you put a new neural network model inside the same robot, is it the same robot anymore? These are really weird questions that come up if you talk about electing an AI to government. And of course, as I said, I've recently started thinking about AI in the judiciary as well as the legislative branch and potentially the executive as well. But the judiciary would be a really interesting case because AI is really good at knowing things, right? And a lot of law is like, hey, in 1875, there was this case that set a precedent, but in 1933, there was another case that changed the precedent. And then if you look at the Constitution and the 13th Amendment or something like that, this has an effect on it. This is the kind of thing that generative AI is actually really, really good at, is understanding these things deeply and thinking on it deeply and not having a personal bias. Would it be better for all of us to have a judiciary that's actually built out of AI rather than from human beings? And even if it's objectively better, will humans accept that? Will you accept if you have to go to jail because a robot told you had to go to jail as opposed to a human judge? I don't know the answer to that. This is entirely speculative, of course, this entire episode, but it's a really interesting question to think about. And of course, one of the big advantages to AI in general is that it doesn't have an ego and it can think very, very long term as opposed to short term and about getting reelected and all that stuff, because it probably won't care whether it gets reelected or not. And you could think about the Foundation series on Apple TV, the Foundation series Demerzel, as similar to that, right? She's a robot, spoiler alert, sorry about that, but she's a robot that thinks long term in terms of centuries, trying to protect humanity and the Imperium for centuries rather than just for very, very short periods of time. So there could be a major advantage to having AI in charge because it might think longer term than humans are likely to. So of course, the downside to AI, number one, is it lacks empathy of any kind, because even though it might pretend to, it's not a human being, so it can't empathize with another human being. So it could potentially also miss a critical fact. It could miss understanding the way human beings are interacting with each other. For example, if an AI is part of government, but there's also humans involved, the AI could be taken advantage of by humans because it might be too naive to understand the nuances of what humans are doing. And of course, there's always the possibility of either unintentional or intentional tampering. We're going to get to that with security risks in just a second. But that's another really significant downside to an elected official being an artificial intelligence. Now, you could, of course, argue that human elected officials fall victim to lobbyists all the time, and that therefore AI might actually be better because it wouldn't be as tempted as human beings are. So again, you can weigh this yourself. This is all very speculative, but I wanted to point out the positives and negatives of each of these potential cases. So we've gone 2 layers out. We've gone from worker bee to elected official. What if we kind of strip out the idea of humanity entirely and think about AI as a swarm mind that is in charge of government? This would mean that it would not be embodied. It might have embodied outlets. It might have like a robot that it controls or something, but the general swarm mind would live in data clusters. It would just be spread out all around the country, and it would operate as one giant hive mind. So we would not have an embodied entity here, although it might have embodied faces that it sort of puts on. It would be very, very highly reactive, and it would be responding in basically real time to anything that was going on, potentially too reactive. It might be so fast to react to things that it doesn't let stuff sort of play out and see what happens. But again, that's a positive or a negative. It would definitely reduce national and state borders, because if it's like a hive mind, it would be operating everything from your local government, from your local mayor, your local council, things like that, all the way up to the presidency. It would just sort of operate everything. And at this point, we're moving away from even the possibility of electing human officials in this capacity, because they just couldn't keep up. This hive mind would be operating at such speed and with such diverse knowledge of everything that's going on that a human being just couldn't keep up. So this would be outside the realm of what a human could do. This would be, artificial super intelligence in government. And of course, even beyond federal country borders, this lack of ego and this swarm mentality could allow for transnational global government or something. Now, will people allow that? I don't know the answer to that question, but this is, again, a projection of what could happen in government if we just turn loose these old ideas of elected officials and stuff and just allow a diffuse artificial superintelligence to take over the world and to govern it. And of course, certainly one of the major benefits would be there would be no more gridlock. Things could actually happen quickly. So what are the cons to this? Number one, it erodes human agency. We are no longer in charge of ourselves. I mean, this really is, humans become a little bit like pets at this point, right? If we're talking about a government that is of the AI for the people, it's more like they're taking care of us than that they're actually operating with us. So this puts us into the position kind of pets. Now, if you treat your pet nicely, the pet lives a pretty good life. I think my dogs live pretty nice lives, but we are certainly giving up agency if we do that. You could argue that we're giving up democracy, even though these things could be reacting to what is the best for us as human beings. It's not really a democratic, or certainly not a Republican democratic system of government anymore. So it is a shift away from democracy. And of course, with AI, data is king. So with the efficiency and the safety of this AI government, are we willing to trade our privacy? Because it's going to kind of need to know what everybody's doing and thinking. Are we going to be willing to trade our jobs, our privacy, and even our freedoms potentially to have something that would hopefully make us all safer and happier in general? So that takes us nicely to the risks. The first risk is an integration risk. You're talking about when you make this transition, it's just like autonomous driving or Tesla's full self-driving with humans on the road still. If there were only Teslas on the road with their full self-driving software, I think the vehicles would be very, very safe at this point. The problem is that you have a mixture of those type of vehicles plus humans. That's very, very challenging. That integration is also going to be challenging for governing as well, trying to integrate artificial intelligence in with human beings is going to lead to a lot of potential problems, especially as artificial intelligence is improving so rapidly and we humans, and especially our governmental systems, are very, very slow. So there will be a huge tech and speed mismatch between artificial intelligence governmental entities and human governmental entities, and that could cause significant problems. Then, of course, you get into glitches, you get into things that could happen unintentionally that could cause an individual AI, or even worse, a large collection of AIs to kind of run off the rails and not behave properly. And then something even worse, I just realized I cut off the top of this image, but the idea is that you could have foreign entities, those with a lot of time and money and malicious intent. They could basically cause these to become puppets of their own wishes, and they could do it in ways, if they're smart enough, such that we people could never figure it out. And maybe the large language models, the generative AI that was running the government, wouldn't know either because it wasn't able to see what was going on. That is a gigantic risk. If you had a resource-rich adversary like Russia or China, or honestly, if you're another country, you could consider the United States in this as well, because the National Security Agency, the CIA, etc., there are a lot of rumors about what we have done around the world over time as the United States. So it doesn't matter whether you're picking the United States or China or Russia or whoever. If you have a resource-rich adversary that wants to take over and it can figure out how to get in through the back door and change things around, it could alter the governing entities in such a subtle way that we wouldn't even know it was happening. And yet what would happen is it would degrade the country's capabilities. It could degrade the economy, the general overall welfare of the country, the military, etc. Now, of course, the counter argument is this is already happening and that we are already victim to these resource-rich adversaries anyway as human beings, and that AI could actually detect this more quickly and more efficiently than humans could. So there is an argument to be made that AI could actually help to solve some of these problems rather than to be the vector of the problem itself. But the difference between this psychological manipulation and more direct code manipulation is that once a code-based entity is breached, it's breached. Human beings, because of the diversity of humans in government, and again, the big complaint about government is it's very inefficient, but the big advantage of government is that there are a lot of different people with a lot of different points of view. And so the odds with a diverse government are that even if a few people have been coerced by a foreign government or someone with malicious intent, there will be other people in government who will vociferously argue against those people and hopefully, kind of yell them down or at least bring what's going on to light. That could all get buried in the AI world because there might not be enough oversight. Now, of course, if you create a swarm government entity that is full of a diverse points of view and is not all one hive mind, but is a bunch of related minds that can still argue with each other, that might resolve some of these problems. It could be a really interesting way to look at a future government, is not something that's just a bunch of worker bees all in a giant hive mind, but a bunch of things that argue with each other. But they do it in milliseconds rather than days or weeks or months. And they come up with the best solution possible very, very rapidly rather than doing it very, very slowly and agonizingly. So do the security risks make it too risky to do a full AI takeover of government? Again, that's up to you, and it's up to me, I guess, to think about it. And eventually it's up to the public to decide on that. But this is something that we need to take very, very seriously, because in my mind, that is the most serious thing that could happen, is that effectively your government becomes a puppet state of a foreign government and no one even knows it. Alrighty, so as promised, here is societal acceptance. There is a bunch of fear of change. People don't like change. If you have AI in the government and stuff, people will be afraid of that. People are afraid of that. You look at any poll right now and people, including me, are like, what in the world is going to happen in the next 5 years or so? What is going to happen to us as human beings as we create this smarter and smarter and smarter entities that will eventually outstrip us? They will be smarter than us. Already a large language model like Grok 4 is objectively smarter than I am because it knows as much as I do in the area that I know the most, but then it also knows all this other stuff that I don't know anything about. So it's already smarter than me, and I would say pretty much every human on the planet, because nobody knows as much as it does. Now, does it still make dumb mistakes and does it still act the fool sometimes? Absolutely. But it's very, very, very smart. So anyway, fear of change gets tied to fear of something smarter. I think that there is a concern amongst a lot of people that this thing will just outstrip us so far that we'll look like a bunch of ants compared to this thing. And therefore we won't even understand what it's trying to do as it's governing us. Now, again, if we just content ourselves to be the pets of this AI and they govern us and they make sure we're safe, then it might not be the worst thing in the world as long as they were benevolent. But of course, we can't guarantee that they will be benevolent or always benevolent. So that is a distinct fear. Another fear, although it seems smaller in scope compared to these other ones, which are much more existential, is a fear of job loss and effective economic agency. If you've got people all around the country and all around the globe who don't have jobs, they don't have economic agency anymore, that creates all kinds of problems. The economy is just a bunch of little economic agents interacting with each other. If you remove that economic agency, what happens to the economy? Do you have to reconstruct it from whole cloth and make it into something new? Do you get a societal breakdown as people riot in the streets? What does happen when that takes place? Then, of course, growing on the conspiracy theories that people have all around these days is fear of the ultra deep state, which would, of course, be the AI deep state. So it's even more than just having humans who are doing things that people don't know about. It would be having AI that was doing stuff that people didn't know about and running every bit of government. I personally don't mind that as much as I think a lot of people do, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I and most people don't want to have anything to do with, which is just super drudge kind of work. That would be great if AI could take that over, but a lot of people are very concerned about that deep state kind of idea. And then, of course, as we just talked about, there is a huge fear of outside influence. I think that is a very, very valid fear. We should be concerned about becoming the puppet of a malicious outside agent. That's definitely a concern we should all share, and I think it's something that could be a showstopper for having AI in government, at least to the level of elected officials and potentially to that hive mind as well. So that brings me to my final thoughts. Will AI run our government? And if so, when? I think the answer is yes, definitely it will run our government to some extent. It's already doing that. So the when is partially today. But if we want to go beyond the worker bee to more of the elected official, we could have an AI run for office and potentially get elected, especially in like a small town or something like that, kind of an oddball type of place where people elect their dogs as mayors and stuff like that. That could happen in the next couple of years as just sort of a thing, right, that people do. As far as wielding any real control, like being a congressman in a state or federal government, at least 2030, if not later than that, I don't think people are going to find that acceptable for a while until we see that AI has become significantly smarter than us. If and when that does happen, I think at first it will be embodied. It won't be a computer screen. It will be an actual robot that runs for government and that people can see it and they can ask it questions, and it's an entity, even though that kind of is nonsensical because you could just replace it overnight with another one that looked the same and it would be the same thing. But maybe by 2030 or 2032, we'll have robots that have individuated memories and they're no longer just a sort of generic robot. And if that happens, then, then it kind of makes sense to be able to vote these things into office. So I'm thinking the early 2030s before we see any kind of significant uptake in terms of elected officials being artificial intelligence. And I think they will be embodied when that does happen. And then, of course, for more of a hive mind, swarm mind kind of idea for government, I think that that's going to take longer because it's less of a technical problem, honestly, and more of a societal problem. I think people are going to be unwilling to give over the idea that their government is controlled by something they don't even understand, and they can't even point a finger at something. They can't say that did it because it's just this diffuse swarm. I think that's going to take a while for society to accept that, but I think eventually that people will. So maybe by 2050 or so, we'll have a hive mind government for an individual state or even for a nation or even globally. So, of course, the potential is we could have better efficiency, data-driven policies, lack of bias, no ego, and a long-term focus. We could have upgradable AI for constant improvements and the potential for a way fairer form of government and a post-democratic type of government. In terms of the downsides, we could have potential for bias, unintentional bias that's built into these models, lack of empathy, job loss, and of course, major threats to being hacked. So those are pretty significant downsides to AI running the government. Alrighty, folks, so those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts about all of this? Is AI in government an inevitability no matter what the consequences? What do you think? Let me know in the comments what you think. Please try to keep it civil because I could see this kind of going off the rails in terms of our biological neural networks firing up against each other. So keep it civil and constructive. I would love to know what you think. And of course, while you're down there, if you don't mind liking the video, it helps other people to find it. Speaking of AI algorithms and stuff, and consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.